001, everything exploded in one sentence, watched by 17 million people. When Jasmine Crockett stood up to Vice President J.D. Vance over brutal Medicaid cuts, she never expected to be mocked, humiliated, and turned into a punchline on live TV. But just 48 hours later, she filed a $100 million lawsuit that would shake the White House, the courtroom, and the country's conscience. 031, the tide turned on a hidden mic in one sentence, in a showdown where power met precision. What did J.D. Vance say that shattered everything he built? Stay with us. This story is worth every second of your time. The hearing room was a fortress of formality, with columns carved from white stone, the seal of Congress looming behind the dais, and every camera lens trained forward like a loaded weapon. 058, 17 million Americans were watching. Jasmine Crockett stood behind the mic, flanked by binders and a thick manila folder marked Emergency Medicaid Impact. Her voice was calm, but her words cracked like glass. These cuts will strip health care from over 12 million low-income children. They won't vanish from your charts. 121, they'll show up in ERs with untreated infections and broken bodies. Behind her, staffers shifted uncomfortably. She held up a CDC graph, red bars climbing like a scream. This isn't about fiscal efficiency. It's about who gets to survive and who gets left behind. Her gaze was steady, unwavering, even as murmurs broke out across the Republican aisle. 147, then came J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States, pressed into a charcoal suit. He adjusted his microphone without even glancing up. The budget, he said with that signature drawl, is not a place for sob stories. Gasps scattered like shrapnel. Vance didn't blink. We're not here to fund trauma narratives. We're here to fix the system. 211, he leaned forward, lips twitching in a practiced smirk. And frankly, Congresswoman, the government is not your therapy couch. A few aides snickered behind their hands. Jasmine didn't move, but the look in her eyes turned to stone. The insult hadn't just dismissed her data. It had weaponized her compassion. As if on cue, Vance delivered the blow he'd clearly rehearsed. 239, these so-called support programs are nothing more than a financial clown show, he said. An emotional stunt by a party allergic to numbers and addicted to crisis. The words echoed through the chamber like a backhand. One senator mouthed, "Did he just say that?" Others scribbled furiously, reporters tapping their keyboards like machine guns. 303, Vance sat back, proud. The moment felt scripted but deadly real. He had just framed healthcare for children as a circus act. And Jasmine Crockett, the only black woman at that bench, had just been cast as the ringmaster of government excess. Outside those walls, the internet caught fire. 324, Twitter users resurfaced old clips of J.D. Vance from 2022 where he sneered that childless women were cat ladies who pushed handouts because they don't understand real responsibility. That clip was now stitched side by side with today's footage. A vice president calling poor children's health care a clown show. A storm was coming. Jasmine Crockett was still standing, but the tremor had begun. 352, and it wasn't her voice shaking. It was the systems. And yet, just when the room thought it had heard the worst, Jasmine Crockett calmly flipped to the next page in her folder. The tremor in the chamber hadn't peaked. It was only beginning. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The weight of what she carried did the lifting. 415, Jasmine held up a printed report from the Urban Institute, the thick paper rigid in her gloved hands, its contents highlighted in the kind of angry red only pain could produce. This report, she began, her voice slow and precise, like the tightening of a noose, projects that over 12 million children across this country will lose their health insurance if this budget passes. 443, her eyes moved deliberately, locking with senators from red states, Mississippi, Arkansas, West Virginia, states with the highest child poverty rates. That's 12 million lives, she repeated, firmer now, reduced to collateral damage in a war against the poor. She let the words hang. Behind her, an LED screen flickered to life, illuminating a United States map bathed in shades of red. 513, the darker the color, the deeper the suffering. These are not projections created by activists or pundits, she continued. They're verified, peer-reviewed, data-driven figures from one of the most respected nonpartisan think tanks in the country. The chamber was quiet, but not peaceful. It was the silence of something about to crack. This is not conjecture. 538, this is impact, she said. Each word spaced like a drumbeat. Real, measurable harm. Her hand trembled slightly as she tapped the report's binding, but her voice never did. In the seats behind her, an aide held back tears. Somewhere in the third row, a Republican senator slowly uncrossed his arms. 602, Jasmine Crockett was not pleading. She was prosecuting, presenting evidence not of politics but of consequence. You can ignore me, she said. But you will not ignore these numbers. And then, across the long lacquered table, J.D. Vance exhaled and laughed. It started as a low, almost performative scoff, but grew louder, more deliberate, and more cruel with every syllable. 629, if their parents had real jobs, he said, none of those kids would be losing insurance in the first place. The words detonated in the room like a nail bomb. Chairs shifted, mouths dropped. A reporter stopped typing. The oxygen seemed to vanish. Crockett didn't respond right away. Her jaw tightened, but her spine didn't bend. 651, she stared straight ahead like someone who had been preparing for this precise kind of violence her entire life. What did you just say? A female senator whispered, too shocked to control the volume. Others began murmuring, voices laced with disbelief and fury. The hum in the chamber turned into a static roar. One congressional aide put their head in their hands. 719, another recorded the moment on a hidden phone. Crockett said nothing. Not yet. But her hands, now resting on the folder, gripped the edges like the wood beneath her might snap from the force. Vance leaned back as if he'd just made a clever joke at a private dinner party. This is what happens, he added smugly, when a generation is taught that government is their father and the hospital is their inheritance. 749, this time there were no gasps, just stillness. The kind of stillness that comes after someone is slapped so hard it takes a moment to register the pain. The kind of stillness that is in itself a scream. It wasn't just dismissiveness anymore. It was a full-throated indictment of the poor, the working class, and everyone who has ever walked into a clinic with a Medicaid card and a prayer. The cruelty wasn't passive. 816, it was theatrical, designed not only to dismiss, but to humiliate. Crockett's breath slowed. Her face was still, but her silence was volcanic. You could see it behind her eyes, the rising of something vast and ancient, and deadly calm. She didn't need to respond. The room had already turned. Lawmakers shifted uncomfortably. 841, even those who privately agreed with Vance avoided his gaze. And outside those walls, America began to speak back. Within minutes, Twitter exploded. J.D. Vance's 2021 Fox News interview resurfaced like a ghost kicking down the door. The clip played on loop, Vance sneering as he declared that poor Americans should be subject to what he called a laziness tax. 907, the quote, maybe it's time we tax laziness instead of labor. Now, that same man had just claimed that children lose health care because their parents don't have real jobs. The connection was unmistakable. This wasn't a slip. It was a pattern, an ideology sharpened into a weapon, and aimed at the vulnerable. 933, in the hearing room, Jasmine Crockett remained standing. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. But she didn't sit down either. She held the Urban Institute report in her hand like a shield, not made of steel, but of truth. And for a moment, it was stronger than anything power could muster. The war had begun, not over numbers, but over what it meant to be seen as human. 957, the silence that followed wasn't the calm after a storm. It was the inhale before the next explosion, and J.D. Vance had already lit the fuse with a grin. He didn't let her finish. Jasmine Crockett had just begun presenting a follow-up case study, a real story of a 10-year-old boy in rural Louisiana who relied on Medicaid to survive chronic asthma. 1022, when Vance leaned forward, eyes narrowed, voice cutting through the chamber like a serrated knife. Miss Crockett does not represent the working class, he snapped. The room shifted, heads turned, cameras tilted slightly, instinctively zooming in. She represents TikTok, wigs, and delusional politics. 1045, the insult didn't echo, it detonated. The words fell like acid into the room's bloodstream, and even before anyone could react, the weight of it had already settled on every shoulder present. Crockett didn't move. She didn't flinch, but her stillness was louder than fury. It was defiance, coiled and precise. Gasps hissed from the Democratic side like pressure escaping a cracked valve. 11:12, one congresswoman rose to her feet, lips parting in outrage. A second followed, hand raised, ready to object formally. But before either could speak, Vance extended one palm without turning his head, and shut them down with the same theatrical cruelty. "She's not testifying," he said coldly. "She's performing." 11:37, that final sentence, "she's performing," struck with surgical intent. It didn't just challenge Jasmine's arguments. It sought to erase her legitimacy entirely, to reduce her existence, her voice, her presence in that room to nothing more than a stage act. Not a public servant, not a policymaker, just a spectacle. But just when the weight of the last insult had barely begun to settle, J.D. Vance leaned forward again. 12:10, this time, not with a smirk, but with sharpened contempt. He knew exactly what he was doing now. This wasn't political theater anymore. It was character assassination, broadcast live to a nation on edge. His voice cracked like a rifle shot across marble. "You are not Rosa Parks," he said, each word slicing through the chamber with surgical precision. 12:37, "You're an Instagram version of a dream that died a long time ago." The impact was immediate, violent in its stillness. A collective inhale rippled across the rows of witnesses, lawmakers, aides, and journalists. But no one spoke. No one moved. The blow was too precise, too cruel. It wasn't just a personal attack. 13:01, it was a calculated attempt to sever Jasmine Crockett from the very lineage she stood upon. He hadn't simply dismissed her voice. He had tried to delete her from history, to reduce her presence to a filtered thumbnail of borrowed legacy. And he did it on the record, on federal ground, under oath. A camera zoomed in instinctively, centering on Jasmine's face. 13:25, her expression was frozen, not in shock, but in something more primal. It was the silence of someone who had heard this kind of venom before, who had learned to stand in its fire without burning. Her jaw locked, her gaze didn't shift. Not even a single blink betrayed her. She didn't look at Vance. 13:47, she looked through him, as if the structure of what he represented was already collapsing in her mind. Around her, aides stiffened, fingers curled into fists. One senator's lips moved silently, mouthing words that never made it to air. The entire room sat in a paralysis of moral nausea, unsure if they'd just witnessed a political exchange or an act of spiritual desecration. 14:14, the attack wasn't random. It was a culmination. For years, J.D. Vance had flirted with rhetoric that hollowed out movements he didn't understand. In 2023, during a right-wing podcast appearance, he declared, "The civil rights movement has been turned into theater." That comment back then had ignited a 48-hour social media firestorm before it faded under newer headlines. 14:46, but now, with Crockett standing in flesh and blood, he had taken that sentiment and hammered it into her spine. This wasn't just about disagreeing with policy. This was ideological vandalism. He was accusing her of cosplay, of appropriating a dead dream to build a brand. He had called her a fraud, not with data, but with disdain. And yet, in that split second after his words dropped, Jasmine Crockett didn't shatter. She didn't react. She refused to react. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. The kind of silence that holds back a tidal wave because the world doesn't deserve to see it crash just yet. But in her stillness, you could feel the room recalibrate. 15:36, lawmakers looked at each other, not with confusion, but with rising disbelief. The cameras stayed tight on her face. And across the country, the audience watching from couches, classrooms, lunch breaks, and hospital waiting rooms knew they had just witnessed something bigger than an insult. They had seen the exact moment when the mask of respectability slipped and cruelty stood naked at the microphone. 16:02, and Jasmine was still standing. She didn't shout. She didn't storm out. She didn't meet cruelty with chaos. Jasmine Crockett let the silence speak that day, and it roared through the country. But what came next wasn't silence at all. It was steel, and it came exactly 48 hours later, not in the form of a rebuttal, but in the form of a legal document that would send shockwaves through the American political system. 16:31, at precisely 9:04 a.m., in the heart of Washington, D.C., her attorneys walked into the U.S. District Court carrying a binder, The Weight of Reckoning. The case was filed under federal jurisdiction, Civil Division, Crockett v. Vance. The complaint was 74 pages long, dense, calculated, and brutal in its clarity. It accused Vice President J.D. Vance of public defamation made with malicious intent and rooted in racial and political prejudice. 1703, all delivered on a live, nationally televised government broadcast. The filing read not like political theater, but like a forensic report on humiliation, that his language was intended to inflict reputational harm, that his attacks were neither policy critique nor protected speech, and that he had crossed a line so clear the Constitution itself had no interest in shielding him. 1730, these weren't opinions, they were legal blades. At the center of the suit was one number, $100 million. $25 million for direct damages, career injury, personal distress, and targeted public shaming. But the second number was sharper, $75 million in punitive damages, calculated not only to punish Vance, but to send a message. 1757, a message that would echo into every Senate chamber, committee room, and national hearing. Power is not a license to dehumanize. Crockett's lawyers wrote it like a manifesto. This action is not merely for redress. It is to establish that intentional racial degradation has no refuge in the architecture of American democracy. Not even in the vice president's chair. 1824, reporters swarmed the courthouse within the hour. Flashbulbs lit the stairs. Anchors rushed to live feeds. Legal experts were summoned to comment before the ink had dried, because it was unprecedented. Not just historically, but structurally. No sitting vice president had ever been sued by a sitting member of Congress for personal misconduct in a live hearing. 1852, yet, Crockett's legal team was ready. They cited landmark cases, Gravel v. United States, affirming that speech outside the legislative process is not immune. Hutchinson v. Proxmire, proving public figures cannot weaponize the First Amendment as a shield for personal defamation. These were not obscure footnotes. They were torpedoes. 1920, and then came the line that turned the case from bold to seismic. The complaint argued that J.D. Vance, in using a televised hearing to launch an intentional, racialized character attack, had acted outside his constitutional role and thus outside his immunity. It was a surgical argument, and one that legal scholars couldn't ignore. 1943, the moment those words were filed, Crockett's lawsuit became more than an act of resistance. It became a threat to the myth of untouchability. The vice president had laughed. He had insulted her wig. He had likened her activism to cosplay. But now he was no longer above the consequences. And as the news broke, a phrase began trending online, as if the country itself had reached a verdict before the court. 2013, she filed what he couldn't fight, the truth. The lawsuit had detonated across the Capitol like a depth charge. But J.D. Vance didn't retreat. He reloaded. 48 hours after the filing, with cameras now chasing him instead of following, he stepped behind a podium outside the West Wing, flanked by American flags, and a silence so rehearsed it felt manufactured. 2041, his jaw was tight, his cufflinks gleamed, and the smirk that once adorned his face in the hearing room had been replaced by something colder. Calculation dressed as calm. Politics, Vance began, voice slow and measured, is not a space for wounded feelings. He didn't blink. He let the words breathe like poison in a still room. 2105, we cannot allow public discourse to become a therapy session for the emotionally fragile. He looked directly into the sea of cameras, his expression locked in the classic stoicism of a man used to dominance, a man who still believed he controlled the narrative. This is not bullying. This is governing. And if my tone made anyone uncomfortable, perhaps they are in the wrong profession. 2132, his words echoed with the forced gravitas of someone defending not truth, but ego. And yet, for all his effort to appear composed, the cracks were already showing, just not in his voice. In the footage. Because by the time he reached the fourth sentence, a different story had already begun to circulate on every major network, on every phone, on every screen in every newsroom. 2159, a six-angle multi-camera splice of the congressional hearing had gone viral, pulled from C-SPAN feeds, freelance journalists, and even a handheld stream from a congressional aide, and it showed something J.D. Vance never expected the public to see in full, him red-faced, teeth clenched, jabbing his finger across the bench at Jasmine Crockett with visible fury. It captured his voice rising an octave. 2228, it caught the vein in his neck pulsing. It showed the moment he lurched forward in his chair, his posture no longer that of a calm policymaker, but of a man unhinged. Every angle told the same story. This wasn't governance. It was rage wearing a title. A slowed-down version of the footage revealed the twitch in his right hand as he leaned toward her desk, lips curled back in something that no press secretary could spin. 2301, side-by-side comparisons flooded social media. His line, "Politics is not a space for wounded feelings," played in split screen next to footage of him pointing, sneering, shouting. One outlet looped it under the headline, "Calm men don't point like this." Another simply aired it raw, unedited, titled, "The Vice President, Unmasked." 2327, and Jasmine. She hadn't said a word since the lawsuit. She didn't need to. Because now the nation had seen what she'd seen. And they didn't just hear the insult. They saw the face that delivered it. And as the footage of J.D. Vance's outburst tore through every feed and fiber of public consciousness, the silence from Capitol Hill's power brokers fractured and turned into fury. 2351, the very next morning, three of the most prominent progressive voices in Congress acted in unison. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ayanna Pressley, and Ilhan Omar each signed a blistering letter addressed to the House Committee on Ethics, printed on official stationery and hand-delivered with cameras trailing every step. The letter wasn't diplomatic. 2400 hours 17, it was fire on paper. The vice president's behavior constitutes not only a breach of decorum, it began, but a calculated assault on the dignity of a sitting member of Congress and, by extension, the communities she represents. They demanded immediate review. They demanded disciplinary action. And they demanded something rare in Washington, moral courage. 2400 hours 44, this institution cannot afford the luxury of silence, the letter read. No one, not even the vice president, has the right to weaponize their office to humiliate and dehumanize. The momentum rippled. Pressley stood at the Capitol steps flanked by supporters and delivered a thunderous rebuke. "We are not asking for civility," she said. "We are demanding accountability." 25:08, Ilhan Omar's voice cracked during a press briefing as she recalled her own experiences with public dehumanization. "This isn't about partisanship," she said. "This is about the line, and how far past it he stepped." And AOC didn't mince a single syllable when asked by a reporter if the Democratic Party was overreacting. 25:31, overreacting, she shot back. "What would you call it when a woman is stripped of her identity, her history, and her humanity on national television, and we're supposed to just move on because he wears a flag pin?" That same day, over 42 members of the Congressional Black Caucus, the Progressive Caucus, and key allies in the Women's Caucus signed onto a public resolution condemning J.D. Vance's conduct. 26:00, the language was brutal, deliberate, and surgically aimed. This chamber must never normalize cruelty as discourse. Overnight, the line between political loyalty and moral clarity began to buckle under the weight of the moment. News anchors posed the question no one expected to ask in an election year. 26:20, can a vice president be censured for verbal misconduct? The conversation had shifted. What started as an insult was now a test, not of Crockett's resilience, but of the system's soul. And as the roar of political fallout echoed through Capitol Hill, the storm finally entered its most volatile terrain, a federal courtroom. 26:41, what had begun as a televised insult had evolved into a legal trial, with the eyes of a fractured nation locked on one question: when power is used to humiliate, can the law still speak louder? The courthouse in downtown Washington, D.C., stood like a monument to consequence. On this morning, its granite columns cast long shadows across Constitution Avenue, as if the building itself understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. 27:12, the plaza was swarmed by satellite trucks, journalists wrapped in coats despite the early autumn heat, and a crowd of citizens holding signs, some calling for justice, others clinging to silence. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Every seat taken by attorneys, students, civil rights historians, and exhausted staffers who knew they were no longer witnessing process, but precedent. 27:39, the feed was live, broadcasting coast to coast. Over 11 million Americans were watching in real time, not just a courtroom, a crucible. J.D. Vance entered first, flanked by three attorneys known for defending billionaires and breaking settlements. He wore a tailored gray suit, but it did little to hide the storm behind his eyes. 28:03, not anger, not shame, but a kind of hollow calculation. His face was locked, his steps stiff. He nodded at no one. He didn't speak. The courtroom didn't greet him. They only watched like an audience, unsure if they were about to witness a defense or a dissent. He took a seat without ceremony, his fingers interlaced, white-knuckled and still. 28:24, then the doors opened again, and Jasmine Crockett walked through. She didn't need security. She didn't need spectacle. Her presence spoke for itself. A fitted black blazer wrapped her frame like armor. Her gold-rimmed glasses glinted beneath the overhead lights, and in her arms she carried a red folder, thick as a legal brick. 28-51, 200 pages of testimony, internal communications, fact-check transcripts, expert declarations, and media analyses. She moved with grace sharpened into purpose. Each step echoed like a drumbeat through the vaulted chamber. She didn't look at Vance. She didn't need to. Her eyes were fixed forward, not on vengeance, but on record. 29:16, as she sat, her hands calmly placed the red folder on the table. No shaking, no hesitation. This was not a woman seeking vindication. This was a woman delivering it. When the judge entered, the room dropped into a silence so total it felt like oxygen had been pulled from the air. An elder jurist with a reputation for brutal clarity and zero tolerance for grandstanding. 29:40, he took his time scanning the room. His gaze stopped briefly on Crockett, then on Vance, then he spoke, and the gavel hadn't even fallen yet, but his words were a verdict of their own. This case is not about ideology, he said, voice as smooth as iron. It is about the ethical limits of power when spoken aloud. 30:02, no one breathed. No one blinked. There were no opening statements yet. No exhibits entered into evidence. But in that moment, something tectonic had shifted. This wasn't about what was said. It was about who believed they had the right to say it, and who refused to let that go unchallenged. 30:25, and after the judge's voice cleaved the courtroom in two, separating politics from power, noise from truth, the silence was broken not by thunder, but by a calm request. Jasmine Crockett's lead attorney stood with the poise of someone who knew the difference between performance and precision. No grand gestures, no raised voice, just a single sentence spoken like a blade being unsheathed. 30:51, Your Honor, he said, his voice steady but laced with voltage. With the court's permission, we ask to introduce audio evidence obtained during the plaintiff's last televised appearance with the defendant, captured through a concealed microphone embedded in her earpiece, worn for accessibility and transcription purposes. 31:15, there was a moment, brief and charged, where the entire room seemed to tilt forward. J.D. Vance's legal team stiffened, one whispering behind a stack of folders, but they didn't object. They couldn't. The request was legal, the source admissible, and everyone in the room, including Vance himself, already knew what was coming. 31:35, the judge nodded once, a silent cue. The technician moved to the terminal like a soldier approaching detonation. The screen remained blank, but the courtroom speakers came alive with a faint hiss, that subtle electric anticipation of something about to explode. Then it came. J.D. Vance's voice. Crisp, clear, unmistakable, asterisk, all we need is for her to blow up and we win. Someone like her is easy, asterisk. 32:05, asterisk, you just push and push until the reaction writes the headline for you. Asterisk, the words didn't echo, they detonated. It was the kind of sentence that doesn't require interpretation because the malice is built into the architecture of the syllables. He hadn't been caught off guard. He hadn't spoken in error. This wasn't a heated moment. 32:28, it was cold strategy, a chess move cloaked in condescension, designed to manufacture collapse. In 10 seconds, he admitted not only to provocation, but to preying on a black woman's pain for political spectacle. The courtroom froze. No coughs, no scribbles, no shifting chairs. One juror, a black woman in her late 50s, hands clasped tightly in her lap, pressed her lips shut so hard they whitened. 33:02, she didn't flinch, but her eyes glistened. A male intern in the media gallery stared down at his notepad, not writing, just stunned. And in the defense seat, J.D. Vance's body changed. His back hunched slightly, his face fell. His shoulders sank as though the weight of his own voice had finally landed. He didn't look up. He didn't meet the judge's eyes. 33:24, he simply lowered his gaze, not out of remorse, but out of exposure. And as the echo of J.D. Vance's voice faded from the courtroom speakers, that brutal recording laid bare for the nation, his defense team moved with visible urgency, like men trying to stitch a wound before the bleeding reached the floor. His lead attorney stood, clearing his throat with the practiced calm of someone used to walking back the unspeakable. 33:52, that recording, he said, voice firm but thinning at the edges, was taken out of context. It reflects internal strategy, not defamation, a campaign tactic, not a personal attack. He spoke quickly, almost too quickly, as if speed could outrun truth. This is politics, he added with clipped precision. Not libel. Not every sharp word is slander. 34:18, he paused, scanning the jury as if daring them to separate cruelty from calculation. But the silence that followed wasn't assent. It was rejection. His words landed like plastic over fire. They didn't soothe. They suffocated. Everyone in the room could feel it. They weren't watching a defense. They were watching a retreat. 34:42, then, with devastating timing, Crockett's counsel rose. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pace or dramatize. He simply turned, tapped a key on the courtroom monitor, and brought up a document that froze the oxygen in the chamber. It was an email. Plain, clinical, but venomous in its simplicity. 35:06, subject line, * push buttons hard. Make her scream, * header, timed provocation, make her snap on camera, dated 3 days before the hearing. Sent from a senior staffer on Vance's communications team. * reviewed. Approved, * the room reacted not with noise, but with gravity. A collective realization sinking in like cement. This wasn't theory. This wasn't reaction. 35:34, this was a blueprint. A planned emotional ambush aimed at a sitting congresswoman of color, and disguised as debate. The phrase, make her scream, flickered on the screen for an extra breath, just long enough for the jury to absorb its full weight. This, the lawyer said, voice cutting through the silence like glass through cloth, is not strategy. This is orchestration. 36:03, this is targeted humiliation engineered at the highest level of government media operations. J.D. Vance didn't object. His attorney didn't respond. Neither could. Because the document spoke for itself. Because the truth wasn't just audible anymore. It was visible, undeniable, institutionalized. And Jasmine. She didn't flinch. 36:28, she didn't glance at the screen. She'd already lived the line those men had written. She had walked into that hearing knowing they wanted her to break, and she hadn't. Now, with the world watching, the proof wasn't in her voice. It was in his plan to silence it. And as the courtroom still simmered with the fallout of the exposed email, * push buttons hard, make her scream *. 36:50, there was no pause, no breath, no refuge for J.D. Vance. What followed wasn't just legal procedure. It was reckoning. The next act belonged to cross-examination, and it was clear from the moment Crockett's lead counsel stepped forward this wouldn't be a volley of abstract legal theory. It would be a scalpel slicing into the machinery of manipulation, lived before the American public. 37:18, the attorney approached slowly, with a single page in hand. No binder, no prop, just a plain sheet printed in black ink, folded once along the middle. His walk was unhurried, his face unreadable, but the tension in the room had begun to crackle again like an old wire holding back a flood. The jury was alert. 37:41, reporters leaned forward. And J.D. Vance, now seated in the witness chair beneath oath, adjusted his posture ever so slightly. A twitch in his collar, a glance at his lawyer, a dry swallow caught under the microphone. The attorney stopped a measured distance from the stand. His voice, when it came, was calm. Too calm. A quiet precision meant not to provoke, but to expose. 38:05, Mr. Vance, he began, did you ever say, in any internal meeting or communication, this is an opportunity to discredit people like her? The words dropped with surgical accuracy. Not a question, but a trap laid bare, and Vance knew it. He hesitated, not visibly, not dramatically, but in the way trained liars do, a microsecond too long before answering. 38:36, his fingers tapped the edge of the wooden platform. His gaze lowered for a beat, and when he looked up again, his voice had a forced steadiness, the tone of someone rehearsing neutrality. I don't recall specifically. The room didn't move. It didn't need to. The dishonesty wasn't in what he said. It was in how carefully he didn't say more. 38:58, the phrase, I don't recall, didn't exonerate him. It incriminated him by omission. It screamed deflection. On the juror's bench, a woman with silver braids folded her arms, her brows tightened. To her, and to many watching across the country, that answer wasn't an uncertainty. It was a pattern. Before the counsel could press further, it happened. Jasmine Crockett stood. 39:24, she didn't raise her hand. She didn't wait for permission. She stood because the moment demanded it. Because truth sometimes doesn't request a microphone. It walks into the room and dares silence to challenge it. She took one step forward, her black suit sharp as a blade catching the fluorescent lighting. Her heels struck the floor like punctuation. 39:47, she didn't look at the judge. She didn't glance at the jury. Her eyes never left J.D. Vance. And when she spoke, it wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The issue isn't that you forgot, Mr. Vance. It's that you've done it so many times, you don't even notice anymore. Her voice was iron draped in velvet. Controlled. 40:08, controlled the way a dam controls a flood. Each word was its own gavel. The force of them wasn't in volume. It was in the unbearable weight of accuracy. The moment didn't erupt. It constricted. The entire courtroom seemed to shrink around her words. You could hear the tightening of breath, the subtle click of a camera lens adjusting, the soft rasp of a notepad being clutched harder by a reporter. J.D. Vance didn't respond. 40:36, he didn't blink. He didn't shift. But his body betrayed him in other ways, the tightening at the corner of his mouth, the sudden rigidity in his shoulders, the involuntary twitch in the corner of his left eye. He had walked into that courtroom armed with legal ease and plausible deniability. But Crockett's sentence, that one measured sentence, had broken through every layer of performance, because it wasn't just about him. 41:06, it was about every man in every room who had ever cloaked condescension in strategy, every insult framed as policy, every smear passed off as debate, every attempt to reduce a woman of color into an emotional caricature so she could be dismissed before she was heard. J.D. Vance didn't have to remember that line because he didn't believe it was wrong when he said it. And that was the point. 41:30, Crockett's words didn't merely rebuke, they revealed. She wasn't accusing him of a single remark. She was indicting the entire system that allowed men like him to weaponize decorum while practicing degradation. She was speaking not just for herself, but for every woman who'd ever been baited, dismissed, talked over, or pushed to the edge so their passion could be turned into ammunition against them. 41:56, the courtroom remained frozen. The judge didn't interrupt. The jury didn't flinch. Even the defense attorney,